Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1214th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Cameron Gaynor and Caroline Kent. And now I'll introduce today's guests and co-hosts. Cameron Gaynor is a visual artist making work in a diverse range of media. Over the last 2 decades, Gaynor has combined scientific and artistic inquiry in his expansive practice. His past works include using the world's most light-sensitive camera to capture bioluminescence and casting time out of 4 billion-year-old meteorites. He is the founder of The Third Rail, an internationally distributed publication devoted to discussion of modern and contemporary art, politics, philosophy, and culture. And moving beyond the borders of the canvas, Caroline Kent's formal investigations expand into sculpture, architecture, and installations. Drawing on personal archive of painted works on paper, Kent's use of the color black functions doubly. On one hand, it is a conduit for understanding color. On the other hand, it is a site for exploring new forms and geometry. Kent's work takes language and transforms it into site context for the projection of desire, wonder, and alternate fictions. And with that, I will hand it over to Caroline to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magley, and thank you, Chloe, and thank you to Feng Bui and the entire Brooklyn Rail for bringing this conversation together. It happened quite quickly. So I also want to just thank everyone for joining us today. It's a beautiful day right now in Chicago. It is Expo Week, and I'm certain people are tempted to be outside than stay inside. So I really appreciate, both of us really appreciate everybody joining us today for this pretty cool conversation between two old friends. So I want to introduce Cameron Gaynor. Cameron and I have been friends for over 10 years, and this is a really great and unique opportunity for us to sit down. It's serendipitous in that we both have shows that are currently up right now in Chicago, and they are only within a couple blocks of each other. So if you look in the chat, there are going to be links to where you can see both of the shows. And I think during Expo Week, there's a lot going on, but it will not be missed to get into some of the galleries in the city and check out the exhibitions. So, how you doing, Cameron?
Good. I'm good. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for doing this with me and spending the time today. It's a chance to talk. And yeah, if you're in Chicago, please come say hi. I'm here for the next 3 days hosting the gallery. So looking forward to seeing folks.
Yeah, I'm at home today, but Cameron's in the gallery at Engage Projects. So feel free to stop in and say hello, but maybe wait until the Zoom is over. So I'd like to kind of introduce everyone to some more of your background before we jump into your exhibition that's up. It would be wonderful to kind of walk us through a little bit of your practice so that we get more of an understanding of how you approach art making and how we can understand what is going on at the current exhibition in relation to what you've done in the past. So
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for asking that question and giving me the opportunity to do this. Actually, the new exhibition is cyanotypes, and I think as opposed to being an artist, a cyanotype artist, I am an artist using cyanotypes, and so a little context to how I've been thinking about photography and image making. I thought I'd start with a piece that I made in 2013 that's ongoing. It's a piece called Sunset Sunrise. This piece is actually an image of the sunset. I was trying to sort of think about the most contrived image in photography, like everybody's taking that sappy image of a sunset, and there's a projector projecting an image of the sunset. In front of that is a hand-blown hourglass. And as the sand comes down in the hourglass, it reveals the sunset and creates a sunrise. It happens at the same speed as the sun rising or setting, which I was also really interested in, this sort of the pace at which there is movement, but that movement's not perceptible. We all know that moment where you're watching the sunset and you can't see it fall beneath the horizon, but through sort of a recognition and a moment looking back, you can remember where the sun was before. So over 18 minutes, the sun sort of rises out of the horizon. And I think that just shows a sort of early on the interest in photography and the idea of focusing on light itself, projection. I come from an experimental film background. I went to school to study film with Stan Brakhage at Boulder. I ended up in the sculpture program, making sculptures as he became sick during that time and was being treated for cancer. And so I fell into a sculpture program and started making objects, but simultaneously was also engaged in looking at a lot of experimental film. So I was also looking with this piece, a way to sort of animate a still photograph. Could you make something still into a sort of moving image to recreate that space?
Yeah, that's a beautiful description. Thank you for that, Cameron. But one thing that sticks out to me over the years, I've always thought of you as such a romantic when it comes to being an artist. And I don't talk about it much overtly, about my own practice, but I do think it's where we kind of line up with this kind of romanticized way of viewing the world. And yours really connects to your environment and this slow moment, the slow, quiet moment of the sunset, of a natural phenomenon that happens every day.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how maybe that becomes a thread in your work or how you locate that through each project?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think we both have this impulse, which is to say that I think I am sort of three different people at different stages when I'm making work. One is the scientist, another is the romantic, and then the third is actually just the producer, the act of actually creating the work. And oftentimes, I have to engage all three of those parts. But sometimes I hide one of like more often when I start to talk about artwork, I get stuck on the technical terms. Whereas, I mean, I'm literally showing an image of the sunset. It is the sappiest, most romantic image you can show anybody. And so it's ridiculous to me in some ways, I'm still learning about, so I'm 52 years old right now. And I've just realized after, decades of making work that I'm a landscape artist. That's something that I've in the last year learned. And here I am again showing an image of a sunset, and I didn't think of myself as that before. I think that's an interesting space. But there, you'll see that thread throughout. The next piece that we're going to look at is a film that was shot in Puerto Rico. And I think, so I was interested in sort of the attempt to create a portrait of the largest thing imaginable, which is the universe, using a single-celled organism, which in this case is a dinoflagellate, through the movement of a synchronized swimmer, an Olympic synchronized swimmer who's named Luna del Mar. Her father named her Moon of the Sea. It is a deeply romantic piece. I mean, it's hard not to see the romance in this piece. It is also very scientific, and it engages, I think, a history of, for me, a experimental film. Specifically, it Stan Brakhage's Moth Light, where he put moth wings between two strips of film and projected them through an optical printer to create a sort of expansive exposure that almost looks like the universe folding in on itself. This is Luna's swimming just at the surface. We're using the most light sensitive camera in the world at the time that was used to shoot real-time images of deep space. It's pointed down as she's swimming below us. She's sandwiched between the sky and the water in a similar manner. And the only light that you'll see in this is the single-celled organism. There's a beautiful soundtrack that was created by the composer Alexander Waterman, a cellist in New York, who I've worked with on a couple films. We can take a peek at that.
Yeah, let's.
The soundtrack itself, you can hear also is it's recorded underwater, sort of alongside um, the actual bay itself. This bay is in Puerto Mosquito, the island of Vieques, just off the coast of Puerto Rico. One of the only constantly blooming bioluminescent bays in the world.
You know, Cameron, I'm really struck by how it seems like your processes for these different projects are so particular that you are really trying to, in many ways, kind of collaborate with nature and the environment to bring about um, and illuminate, to kind of illuminate these different moments that can happen in time. And I'm curious if there is a lot of like experimentation or trial and error before you land on kind of the way that you the process that you end up with that becomes the work itself. Like,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it takes me years to make these projects. This is a great example of why. One is finding the most light sensitive camera in the world. There's only 5 of them made. They all were in Japan. Um, getting in touch with someone there, the Japanese government typically doesn't let them out of off the island. Getting in touch with someone there and actually allowing them to bring it to Puerto Rico and then hang it over the water in the middle of a bay was interesting. But the level of research to find the technology took years. Finding Luna actually took a long time. It was synchronicity that I was looking for a synchronized swimmer and found this Puerto Rican Olympic synchronized swimmer named Luna Del Mar. Those moments I think happen in the studio, those moments of magic where something is just sort of through your process or looking for and uncovering revealed to you and becomes part of a story where in a way as artists, we almost are just sort of, you know, we're allowing the work to come through us. I mean, sort of trying to step out of the way. So much of the practices in the land, I think of earth artists and from the past can be construed as extractive. And it's really important to me to have a relationship with the environment that is leaving no trace, that does not feel extractive. And so I spend a lot of time working with scientists and people in the areas that I'm working in. And to sort of develop a strategy to create the space for these pieces to exist.
yeah, I'm also interested in thinking about collaboration. You're definitely working with environments that have a lot of agency, the earth, wind, water, environments. And so, how do you negotiate that? Like, how much is your hand in the work, and how much do you allow for just natural occurrences to take place? And maybe this question is really more fitting to talk about this new exhibition, but I'm curious with these past projects, how do you think about um, your hand allowing for another hand or being in conversation with another hand that's quite large?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. And I think in the most recent work, I've kind of stepped almost completely out of the way. In the past, that's kind of been my struggle is that I set up circumstances and then try to allow for the sort of the magic of the moment to occur. Sort of the strategy is just getting everything in place and then allowing the subject to sort of like find its own space and trust. I think trust is a word that I think about a lot. It's because you have to believe that something will come from it. This shoot with Luna was really interesting in that it needed a moonlit light. There was only a moonless night to film because any moon or even brighter stars would leave a pattern on the surface of the water. So we had exactly 4 hours between thunderstorms where it was quiet and we could actually shoot. And and this is one take, and it worked out beautifully. It took a lot of trust just to allow that moment to happen. I think the same thing is true with the next piece too, which is naturally illuminated landscape, Nil, which was shot in Tennessee. And the subject in this case is a synchronous firefly that only lives in one place in the world and comes out for 2 months. And I was really interested in looking at a history of landscaping and see if I could actually create a project that shows the landscape in reverse. That is to say that like the light of the firefly, which also sort of creates a level of information is also sort of the destruction of information in the image in a way, the same way that like old film strips would be marked with like a cigarette burn in the middle of them or something, and all that it disappears. So in a way, you're seeing this landscape through the absence of the trees with the light of the fireflies around them. Again, it's setting up the stage. I can't control them. And I think that level, there's always a moment of doubt. I think a lot about something that Joanne Greenbaum said when I was in graduate school and she was visiting, and she said, as artists, we're constantly vacillating between thinking that we are the shit, that we're in control and we have this, and that we are shit. In all these processes, whether it's a painting, shooting photographs, or setting up these moments to film, it takes a true belief and confidence in getting there, and then this moment where you capture it, and it is a moment filled with doubt and uncertainty, and then it's a return back most often to that sort of like belief and a sort of satisfaction when you see that it worked, that the collaboration was successful, and that in a way I've tried to set things up that could certainly fail, but I think when we get to the newer work too, to me, what was interesting is that I was as surprised by the results in my doubt of them at the beginning more than anything else.
Well, you bring up a really good point that I just wonder. I mean, I don't necessarily hear it often enough. It's just the behind the scenes kind of anxiety or struggles that artists have, and the transparency to think about things that fail, ideas that are not complete, or the precarity that exists between the artist and their work. And when something is still in progress and it's not yet, I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, because so often you get to an exhibition and the work looks perfect. It looks ready to arrive to the viewer. But I think the narrative of the artist's life and their studio life is much different than that moment. It's quite different. There's a lot of questions, and then there's a lot of questioning of process. There's a questioning of when something is in its final state. Is it doing all the things that we are hoping it does? Does it do the thing in the world we want it to do? And that kind of self-conversation that we have between us and the work is super important.
Yeah, and being comfortable with doubt. I think also being comfortable with insecurity, and that I think that comes over time. Having gone through that process enough as artists, we learn to recognize that as just a part of the process. There's going to be a moment where you look at a painting or something that you've made recently where it's just not it. You can't see it, and then 15 seconds later, another look, a sip of water, and you feel it again. It's there. And I think always searching for that moment creates the intensity of that interpersonal space, which is certainly a part of our time in the studio.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a good segue to kind of move into this most recent body of work of yours. And I think what is one of the questions that I have, we could actually go back. Actually, we can also look at the painting too, but maybe we'll get back to that. We'll come full circle.
Yeah.
But we could go on and watch the process video, because one of the things that I think is really poignant is that you have this long process. You have a process that takes over the span of months to years, and then you execute and make this work. But now you're at a moment where you're sitting in the gallery and you're sitting amongst the work. And there is still, and this is something that, again, I don't hear it often enough. I wish I did. There's still this kind of unfolding of, what does this all mean? What does this work mean? And how is it still kind of revealing itself to you now that you've had time to just sit and be in a moment of contemplation?
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. I think also it's sort of locating where the work is, right? And with a project like this, to me, it breaks down into stages. So there's the research into the medium, understanding. I started working with cyanotypes in 2016 and did some experiments, and I just couldn't get to where I felt like I wanted to be. I felt like the medium was just a little too restrictive at the time. And then a number of years later, I live in the desert. I'm surrounded by the sand, silica, the base ingredient of all lenses. And once I started spending time in the desert and thinking again about having the chance to revisit that those initial experiments, I feel like it was trusting that space, creating again a sort of a scenario whereby the work could be created, and then seeing what the result was after that point. I feel like that went a little sideways, but does that kind
No, I think it's great. I think one thing, I mean, I enjoy the video. I really love seeing the desert.
Yeah.
And then, and that's an amazingly that landscape leaves an impression. And then then we come into the gallery and we are, instead of seeing the brown desert, the browns and red tones, we're struck with blue, which makes me think of the sky and water. Um, but something else I keep thinking about too is time. And I think in the world we live in right now, it's so fast. The way we consume images is fast. The way that we read the news is fast. We are not spending long amounts of slow time understanding the moment we're in, maybe, or even reflecting back. And so I'm curious for you to kind of tease out a little bit the role of time, not only in this body of work, but in your practice. And it seems like it's something of real value.
Yeah. This also sort of plays back into this idea of creating a structure and a space in collaboration with the sort of environment, with the landscape. I mean, with this project, I really wanted to look at a history of landscape representation and have an opportunity to sort of like see if I could push through it. And the idea of collaborating with the land itself, like if I asked the land what it wanted to make, would it answer? Could I step out of the way enough to allow that process to happen? And part of that was going back into this idea of time. And what I did is I tried to set up a structure whereby I mark out the space, I lay down the photographic material, and then I've collected just the top surface of that area, and I'm returning it back to the surface over about 20 minutes. And the only thing engaging that material at that point is the wind, the temperature, sort of moisture in the air. And I'm trying to step as far away out of the process as I can. I remember early on, a breeze came up and blew the fabric over on itself. And then a bigger breeze came and blew it down the arroyo. These are all made in these dry riverbeds, seasonal dry riverbeds called arroyos, that when it rains, they become sort of raging rivers, and then 30 minutes to an hour later are free of water. So everything I do out there returns back to the landscape only a number of hours or days after I make them. But it's sort of getting away. I was uncertain as to whether they would return or become or look like representations of landscape. And it takes about 24 hours for them to sort of appear. It's a process of, after it's sort of fixed with water, then over 24 hours, the imagery appears. And I just remember that the feeling when the first images came forward, and many of them had like a horizon line and had this single point of light. Immediately I was I was having a sort of like art historical flashback through painting and photography, and a moment where it felt like the earth was echoing the echoes of its own representation through it. And so time is twofold in that sense. It's the time that I'm spending out there. It's the time of the Earth's age, deep time, but then also this weird, like, historic and cultural sense of time and image making. I titled these with numbers because I was so conscious of not wanting to sort of like push people into seeing what I see or having a sort of sense of direction and allowing them to sort of like live in that sort of space of abstraction. But for me, like the earth was sort of answering the question that I had asked in a way. And it did require me to step out. Every time I tried to sort of involve myself or keep something from blowing in the wind, I recognized it as me getting in the way. And so for the first time, going back to the earlier question, I feel like I'm the most removed from that collaboration in this way. And that feels like an evolution in my practice. I feel like, shows often when you have a new body of work, and hopefully there's something that is revealed and that we've learned. And I think in this case, for me, it was that the strength of my practice or my engagement has to do with deep research, but then also deep trust, and stepping back and allowing conditions to live in their own way.
Yeah. Do you think that, okay, so you've been living out in the desert for how long now?
4 years.
4 years. So I think about you growing up in Colorado, and I think about you being a wild young boy running around, sticks, finding, things under rocks, lifting them up, spending a lot of time outdoors, which is not totally unlike my childhood too. There were a lot of play outside, a lot of freedom to discover and to look around, poke at things. I think the desert is a little more dangerous than the Midwest in terms of its wildlife. But did you find yourself connecting in some ways with, just because you're in the earth, you're digging, you're like, was there a sense that connected with, just your upbringing in some ways of
Yeah.
in your
Yeah.
relationship, continuing an adult relationship with the environment and the landscape?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I also think it's something we both share in a way. You grew up in rural Illinois. I grew up in a log cabin with no running water in the mountains, in the deep mountains. And absolutely, in a strange way, I feel like I was really questioning my relationship to the studio. COVID, I had a lot of friends who really thrived in the studio during COVID. I did not. I felt paralyzed by COVID. I felt like the world's pain was more than I could bear, and I just creatively, I was just frozen. And so I really had to rethink what my relationship was to the studio and my practice. And I started going out to what I know, which is the outdoors, which is nature, and spending time out there. And so for two reasons, I also think this is a kind of a natural way to step into your show, because for two reasons. One is that we both share that. Also, I've really recognized and been thinking a lot about the idea of play, and a sort of like an understanding as artists. I think we toil, we work really hard. For me, that tends to be the research side of things. I really enjoy making, fabricating, producing things. But I've also tried to reveal a space which is the actual like joy in the process of making it. For me, it's interesting that you link it back to being young in the mountains. With this new work, I'm going out into the desert, which is basically a sandbox, and I'm making creating a space in the sandbox, putting sand in a bucket and basically pouring it on this fabric. I mean, when I remove myself, from the process, I have to laugh at its simplicity. And at the same time, I'm still enamored and recognize the beauty and the brilliance of the pieces. And so where I might have been afraid of saying something like that out loud like 10 years ago, I'm not anymore. I
Right.
sort of I recognize and appreciate the need to protect that space, and to protect that space in the studio, the joy in the studio, even if you're working with things that are very intense right now. And I feel like, that's one of the things that I really love about your work and your process and the shows that I've seen. As you mentioned, we've been friends for 10 years. I've been fortunate enough to watch your practice evolve, and your curiosity sort of reveal the truths that you're after. And I wonder if we can jump into, if this makes sense to jump into your exhibition now,
Sure.
if we can talk a little bit about what an exhibition sort of reveals about a practice. And I wonder if, there are elements of play that come through that.
Yeah, I like that you kind of put the two words work and play together, because there is, for both of us, there is so much work, but I think there's equal space and equal measure of play that is necessary, because play is what invites freedom. It invites improvisation. It invites you to do something that you don't take so seriously. And I think I rely on that. And I remember, your question of thinking about like what does an exhibition do is something I thought a lot about as I was making the work for this exhibition. I started really thinking about what is the purpose of an exhibition for each artist, and it made me think about going to and seeing exhibitions, going to see shows, and when I walk in there, what am I curious about? And oftentimes it was thinking about, oh, this is the current moment the artist is thinking about. This is their most recent work. So it must be what is consuming them. And for this exhibition, I started thinking about what is it I want people to see or understand about where I'm at right now in the practice. And so I think that's why the title kind of plays a role, the sentimental hand, because I wanted to really foreground my hand and what it does, and whether it's on a large scale painting or whether it's on a small intimate painting, whether I'm cutting paper, all these different intimate, quiet, and sometimes loud or very dramatic moments within my practice are all being shaped through me doing these different actions and activities. And so that's that's one of the ways I started thinking about the purpose of this exhibition. Yeah.
I wonder if, I was struck when I first saw the show, and to the right, when you walk in, there's sort of a wall, a shorter wall in the space, work on the front. Um, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about one of the things I love about your past shows. Each show I see, you introduce a new strategy. There's some new form that is either an echo from something in a painting, it's a recess into the walls. You're thinking about the architecture of the space. I was struck when I first saw your larger paintings by the fact that you had absolutely like removed the frames themselves. The walls become a part of the architecture, and then you're thinking about the walls that they're on. You're actually going into the gallery walls and creating recesses. And the project that we did in 2018, I remember you introduced these sort of sculptures that felt like, chess pieces on a chessboard, characters in a story. And, there is a level of sort of character and cinema that each one of these moves sort of engage. And I wonder with this new show, I was struck by the sort of the introduction of these walls. They're almost like hurdles or screens. They're not entirely walls because you could climb around them, you can climb over them. As much as they're sort of showing, they're also hiding, and they aren't just walls built into the existing walls. To get to the question, I guess, I think it's really interesting as we've talked about this, that you don't think about them as artworks themselves, even though they are sort of sculptures. You think of them as a strategy, or I guess maybe this is a question. These are an extension of the strategy that you've used in the past, as a way to sort of foreground and provide a space for the paintings to sort of exist on a stage.
Yeah, I mean, with this particular exhibition, and first of all, thank you for kind of walking us through those different moments, because I think I approach every exhibition with kind of questions of how I can respond to the space, what can I illuminate that kind of points a finger at the architecture's present and also the architecture of the work. And, one of the things was thinking through to make the decision about these was thinking about a theater prop, thinking about the role of a prop. You know, it's on stage, it has a function, it serves that function, and it's an illusion. It's not, you know, it might be a painted scene, you know, and it's the painted scene is meant to be understood as itself as an object. And so you mentioned, you know, that first moment you walk into the gallery and you look to your right and you're met with this smaller, short wall, and there's an artwork hanging on it. And that that kind of prevention, I'll call it, to not allow a full view of something that maybe invites the viewer to be curious and to want to move themselves so they can see something in perspective, to walk around something, that it's somewhat of a barrier, but I would like to think of it as a prompt to kind of call people to question that space, to think about, why is this here? Let me look around this. Let me see what's on the other side. And when you do that, when you set that up, you're actually kind of choreographing the space some, and that people can flow through in a certain way, walk around and be curious and ask questions. I think that's the most provocative I'm thinking of in terms of allowing the work to kind of be a part of that experience as well. And so it's always unique. It's always, you know, a different way, but I will say this, it's also experimental. And I kind of think of exhibitions as rehearsals. And I don't think that there's any final performance, but I think of the rehearsal as assembling all these artworks together and thinking about what kind of narrative they tell together in the space, what narrative do they say about a practice, and how these things can unfold.
It's
So
it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because I know we've also talked both a lot about our relationship to cinema. And, you know, there have been different moments where at the beginning, when I saw your work, I sort of felt like I was, is it a stage set? Am I a part of the film? Like, are you considering me as a character, as a viewer coming into the space? And while you consider that level of viewership, I feel like more likely what we are is actually, it's almost as if you could walk into a previous existing film that's already, those conversations, if you could come in and just sort of hear the conversations happening, you know, at the table side, without being sort of recognized or part of the story. The story is just going on. You've basically set up these circumstances for a narrative to be occurring. And while you're imagining how people might move through the space itself is functioning itself as its own almost play or film. And I guess my question is in that way, are the paintings themselves the characters, or like what's the character? Where's the character?
you know, some of the forms and shapes really take on personalities for me. But I think also there's a kind of sentiment that's conjured in between when you're looking. So these recent works that are triptychs that I've been working on, they have the recessed shape, and then they have a painted space, and then they have an object inside a space. And all three of those actions, I'll call them, I continue to tease those out throughout the practice. So sometimes the space that's created in a painting will become a space that's created in an artwork or the wall, or an object was once had a life as a flat cutout, a piece of paper, and now has this three-dimensional life that is living. But I also think of like these different scenes in a film and the different things you get from different scenes and what's missing, the absence of something, where their space is allowed. You know, these are kind of where we line up, like with these romantic ways of thinking, but the romantic thinking doesn't necessarily translate one to one. It's not going to show up. Like when you see a recessed space, no one is going to probably think of a landscape in a movie with a voiceover, you know? But these moments of silence, this is where I'm trying to get at. Like, how do I think about expanse, or slowing the viewer down with one scene, or slowing the viewer down with a singular moment? How can an object, or a shape for that matter, take on and personify the different ways that, you know, how I use titles, and I bring in these kind of setups through language that can kind of frame and help the viewer get closer to how I'm thinking about and how I'm feeling about those forms and how they're operating.
I wonder if, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about titles and maybe start with the title of the show, The Sentimental Hand, and where that came from, maybe a little bit of a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, I am fascinated by this Finnish architect. His name is Juhani Palasma. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but um, he wrote a couple books that I've really been inspired by. But this one, he wrote this book called The Thinking Hand, Existential and Embodied Wisdom in Architecture. And I I think that book for me was so down to earth, very practical ways of how our hand is connected to um, the life that we create through objects, through form, through building, through imagining, and through creating. So I thought, I mean, that book was so enjoyable to kind of come across. And I started thinking about like, I think a lot through my hands. I think a lot through the forms that they make. I think a lot through the cuts and the assembling of those shapes. And I wanted to kind of think about him, but also think about, okay, but where's my voice in that? And so the sentimental hand gets at how sentimental I am. It feels like it's over the top. But I think in a lot of the ways that I have gotten at the sentimentality in my work is through these titles. Um, and the title allows for me to kind of set a framework for understanding how I'm thinking about sometimes the whole exhibition, and sometimes these just different pathways in my practice. Um, but I'm also channeling a lot of film that I have seen, and I'm thinking about early film, black and white film that allowed for a kind of way of speaking that wasn't meant to be like everyday life. It was much more nuanced. It was poetic at many times. And if you were going to insult someone or describe someone's character, you were going to use really quick-witted and thoughtful language to do that. And I know that, you know, contemporary film doesn't always get there, but a lot of times I go to international film because it does still continue to operate in that way for me. And so yeah, and it's a fun part because I feel like I do channel a different part of myself when I'm writing the titles and thinking in that way.
I think a lot about the sort of this, well, two things. One, I had the fortunate experience of being with you again when we did that project in 2018, where I saw you title 14 works on paper, and no, I'm not kidding, like maybe 15 minutes, and they were the most eloquent. It was so quick. It was like you had them already in your head, but I mean, you told me there was not it was all made in the moment, and these
I remember.
were like haikus. You just kicked out these haikus in 12 minutes, faster than I'd ever seen anybody write poetry like that. And I wonder, what is that is that prompt for you? Are you looking at that image and is it telling you what it needs to be named, or are you actually applying those words to the way that you want it to be seen?
I'm thinking in both terms. So I remember that. That was definitely a moment where I was just flowing. It just worked. I mean, there's other times where I'm like, I don't have a title. I'm hitting my head against the wall. But I remember that. I just feel like that exhibition, so many great things happened, to use your word, like the synchronicity of it all kind of coming together. And that language really illuminated for me these ideas of like impossible science, the romantics of impossible mathematics, um, physics, gravity, science fiction, all that kind of came together. So I remember that body of work. It all kind of embodied that for me. So the titles came easily. Um, More recently, I have, like for this exhibition, there's two titles that were really fun for me to write. And one of them is called Her Left Hand Spoke Voraciously While Her Right Hand Tucked in Her Pocket. And when I'm writing a title like that, I'm thinking of a specific character in a film I've seen. it's funny because sometimes people will ask me, "Hey, is this a personal thing?" Or with the title, A Phenomenon, he would arrive and she would completely disappear. And I really want people to understand, like, it is a complete fiction. I don't, there's, I have no desire or even no, I don't need to even pull from reality because it's so much more fun to make it up and to invent and to think of a character that can, that can hold these words in their performance. And so this is where I'm also allowing language to perform. I find that when I work on Belgian linen, the shapes are quite distilled and they do have a kind of theater or drama that they evoke for me. And so that's why I tend to really want to sit with the form, sit with the composition, and kind of think about what it evokes for me. Is it a dinner party where people are, a dinner party set in a black and white film with people with martinis in their hands bumping into each other, or someone that needs to insult someone? These were things that really jumped out to me about film growing up, watching black and white films, that still, invite me to delight in them to this day. And yeah, that's really where they come from. And I think one of the challenges I have, you know, as an artist that is a painter who really tries to engage like moments of film, like how do I do that in a cohesive way? How do I continue to do that? And it is a lifelong pursuit, and how it will continue to play out. I'm experimenting and I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to bring them closer and closer and closer.
And clearly you are. I think I wanted to touch on one part of that, sort of your history and your relationship with cinema, watching these international films with your grandmother. Two parts of that. One is that when you're watching something that has subtitles, you're seeing two different things. You're seeing the action and you're reading the words and the dialogue below. And so if you just watch the image, you have an experience of that devoid of actually what is being talked about or
Yeah.
done. I think it's really interesting that my experience with the way that you've set your shows up in the past is that I see the work, and then I read the title, and then I see the work again. And it's, as you've said before, it's almost like a direction or setting up the scene. I re-engage that work. It's almost animated. It's almost like through the titling, you've animated the process of the painting and these sort of like these different elements that are speaking to me. But it's a different experience if I have it without the title. And it's so interesting to me the way that the titles perform in your painting practice, because language is so present. And at the same time that language provides that structure, you're also pushing against it to find a space where it is structureless. So there's a sort of like dichotomy happening, which is a sort of invitation, a sort of like an explanation, but then also a shift. And that goes back to this idea of these walls, the structures, where it's sort of like, I think people have come into the space and they've been like, well, what are these new sculptures that you made? These artworks, you're like, these aren't artworks. They're strategies. And I think you're complexifying your strategies. And every show that I've seen, you add another twist that pushes out even further against the container and those structures as a way to sort of elucidate to yourself. And that's, I guess, the other part that I love about your practice is I feel like you're as curious, if not more, than the way that I come into these things. Like, you're as surprised by the revelations. I don't know that that's true, but I feel that way. That like sometimes something happens in the work where you're just like, I want to be there in the studio where it's like, where you're like, oh shit, this is it. Yeah. Because I see that. I experience that when I walk through the shows.
Yeah, I think too, there's a way that, I'm confronted with artists and their practice. I think there's always these questions of how do we keep ourselves engaged? How do we keep things curious for ourselves? How do I not continue to always just work the same way, return to the same things? Where's the element of surprise? And this is something I thought about when I was looking at your exhibition and thinking that there is such an element of surprise when you open up and unfold the image, and the image is something you did not have control over, right? But I'm also thinking mine happens in a decision-making process. Put this there, try this, do this, don't do this. Set this here, try this. There's still a decision-making process that we set up for ourselves. And how do we push against it? And how do we keep pushing ourselves on and on? And I think that becomes, I don't know, that becomes the rub for artists. It can be really challenging to keep yourself continually engaged and excited to discover something new for yourself, first and foremost in the practice, and then to share that. And I think that's where work comes in, especially as someone that's working in a formal way with, I wouldn't say it's a limited number of shapes, because I'm always hoping to invent new ways these shapes can operate. There's definitely ones that repeat, and then there's other shapes like the one on the screen here, the top of that. I mean, I remember this painting sat in my studio for a while with just the green on it, the foundational green. And I added these other elements later, but I sat because I really enjoyed the awkward negative space it made. It was so awkward. It wasn't a full, complete object. It was kind of a hybrid of an object and a space. And it made me realize how valuable that awkwardness is, that it's not something usual I do. That isn't part of my practice that I'm used to always doing. And I think maybe I'm finding this kind of rhythm with something familiar for myself and something unknown, something uncomfortable, something that's not quite right. And maybe that's where this magic can happen. And so I think, finding those things and continually believing in and having that kind of faith that you talked about earlier in oneself, in one's practice, to continually find that kind of thing is really rich and important. And I can't say it always happens. One hopes it happens,
Yeah. I know that we've been talking over the last couple of years. You're collaborating with an old friend, Rini Mateo, who's a filmmaker, experimental filmmaker, an amazing filmmaker, on this idea of a performative lecture. And the reason I ask about that is because I also think it folds into this idea of the importance of and the role of other artists and friends in the creative process and practice.
Yeah.
And I know you guys are doing this. I don't know a lot. We've talked about it here and there, but I know you're doing it at the Queen's Museum.
Yes.
And I think it's in this spring. Is it later in May? Is that right?
June. We pushed it out a little bit. Yes, I am really excited to work with Rini on this. And I think Rini is joining us right now. So hi to Rini. One of the ideas why I wanted to do this kind of comes full circle. When I did the show with you, there was performance, and it was a way to kind of like work as a painter on the wall and then continually make steps to move out into space. It started in that exhibition. Then there were like paintings that were shaped on the wall. Then there were freestanding kind of sculptures, and then their performance, people moving, bodies. And the idea of performance has always kind of felt like in the atmosphere of my practice. This opportunity to be in conversation with Rini is really kind of platforming how our relationship, which is not unlike you and I's relationship, where artists have shared their lives together and their individual practices influence one another. And the sharing of ideas and the exchanges that happened and the particularities of that, I was really excited to think about how we could be in conversation and perform some of these other moments we've had with each other. Her and I both have a relationship to other languages. So language, not only through abstract painting language, but also, or the language of film, but there's also Korean language for Rini, and there's Romanian language for myself, having lived in Romania years ago, but then we connect through Spanish. And so I think there's going to be interesting ways that we can tease out how these things are going to operate in this lecture, and think about how our practices have influenced one another, but also like helped us build in our own practices and private ways. And so, yeah. And, at this stage, we're both working on it, but it's still such an unknown. And I always try to I've learned this now. And I learned this because of you, Cameron, because when things don't go right, when the unexpected happens, when your paintings get lost in the mail, or when, you find out the deadline is a lot sooner, or a conversation needs to happen publicly on the fly, whatever it is, I'm getting more confident at just embracing, like, let's see what this can become, and not kind of hold on to this idea that we're performing for an audience, a performance of perfection. I have it all together. We have all the answers. It's beautifully done. No, no, no. I really want to see what the nuance, the magic, the mess, any of it, any of that slippage that can happen in that can happen publicly could be great. And I think Rini and I are both after that. Like, let's see what this is going to be. Let's see what we can do and how our practices matter over time through a friendship.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I'm excited to learn more, to hopefully be there in June. And also just to recognize and appreciate what you're saying about that unknown space, being willing to fail, courting failure in many ways. I find that in my own practice, the best projects that I've ever done are the ones where I thought, oh, this is never going to work. There's no way this is going to happen. And then it does. And that really, space is a very valuable space for being able to trust it and say, I'm not afraid of its potential failure. I think that's a really important thing to recognize. Going back a little bit to our rural roots, I wanted to mention also, your commitment back to those spaces. I really appreciate the way that you've gone back into Middle America, gone out of the centers, and really made certain to spend time with students at colleges that might not have access to artists where you are. And I think about the Namath Art Center, which is an art center in Park Rapids, Minnesota, punching way above its league. We both had shows there earlier on in our careers. That's run by Mark Weiler, who I think is with us today too. You're on the board of Second Shift, which is a really exciting residency program for young artists in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that. The belief in that and your desire to engage people who may have been in your position when you were a younger person growing up rurally.
Yeah, I really appreciated any moments of magic in my childhood and growing up as a young person in the world where there was a connection with art. I wish I had a connection a little bit sooner. And so I think because of that, I knew I was looking for it when I was young. I was looking for it. I was looking for to connect with this thing that I had felt in myself. Like, where does it exist in the world and how? And so, I recently did a residency at Beloit College in Wisconsin, and it's a small place and super unique. And I ran into the artworks of Sia Armajani there. Like, you never know what you're going to find around the corner, down the street, in these off the beaten path places that I really enjoy. I mean, I did a show in Iowa and Davenport. And I think because of my connection to having grown up in rural space and done 4-H, and I think these kinds of unique experiences that shape us are meant to connect us. And it's great to be in the city of Chicago, where I'm connecting with the people from Chicago, but also people that are transplants, right? That come from maybe the suburbs or small towns. But I love going back, and I like going to these other places because I do think that unique things can happen in the margins. Magic can happen in the margins or in these peripheral spaces. I'm always looking for it, and I always believe in it. And so the show I did with the Namath was great. I mean, and it did feel like we were far away from the city. But people there, again, were so curious, so invested. And that's what I think also restores my faith, is that people show up and they ask questions and they're curious and they're thankful that you've come. And I just think that there's a wonderful spirit there that operates that I'm going to continue to invest in.
Yeah, well, I think audiences are really fortunate. And again, I think as we get further into the age that we seem to be upon now, it's actually harder for artists to live in the larger cities, and the reality of being able to afford studios in smaller towns is very real. So it certainly seems that there's a richness there that is hungry for engagement. And yeah, that's really special that you continue to do that. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think we're getting close to maybe taking questions. Magli, I'm being mindful of time and didn't want to jump in too quickly here, but does that sound about right?
Yes, if you have a last question, you can ask, but otherwise we're ready to go into audience Q&A.
Yeah, let's jump in.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for such a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed every part of it. We have a couple of questions. The first is from an anonymous audience member, and they're saying this conversation has been such a testament to your history of looking at each other's works and being in community with one another. I wonder if you can speak to the role of conversation and dialogue, or if you can speak to the role that conversation and dialogue plays for each of you in the studio.
I mean, I'll jump right in on that. I'll say, going back to the importance of friendship and artist conversation. I mean, I think again, that moment where this Joanne Greenbaum, where you are shit, where you are not the shit, when you're deep in it and you're not feeling that moment of confidence. For me, that's when I really lean into my friends and the people that I trust. This new work is a really perfect example of that. I had a moment of deep insecurity part of the way through the show, where I felt like I was seeing something, but I wasn't sure if anybody else would. I live in the desert. I'm pretty isolated. There are not a lot of studio visits happening where I am, and a phone call and sending a few images to Caroline, to some of my other artist friends, Aaron Spangler, Ruben News. These are people who very quickly, responded and said, there's something here. I love these. What is this? What's going on? And began to ask questions, and inquire about the process, and also provided me a sort of the ability to recognize, to see that again, to trust that what I was seeing was there. And so I think that alone is a very recent example, shows the strength of it, but it's also a sort of not always just the studio, just life. These are the trials and tribulations of real life, and having friends who've been through the creative process with us, alongside us that long, over a decade, who know you that well. Your kids have grown up, alongside of them. Like, it's a really rewarding and deeply special opportunity for me to have. With Caroline specifically, and I should say her husband Nate, who's going to have a show at the Namath Art Center.
Right.
Also, going back to the Namath, his show opens in June, actually late June.
No, I think conversation is huge, and it's great how it happens. I really wonder, this must happen for other artists, but I feel like whenever I get together with Cameron, or my husband's there, or I'm talking to my friend Milo or Rini, we go from real life, immediately switches over into art so fast, and we start talking about topics or something we've seen or ideas. The ideas are exchanged, and we can go off on a tangent for like, I don't even know if it's a tangent, it's just a road, and we're talking about art ideas. And this happened, when Cameron celebrated his 50th birthday, a bunch of us all came together. We all happened to be artists, and like that time, it's just interesting because we can sit around and we can talk about life, but it's so quickly we start talking about artworks, and we start talking about the struggle of the studio, or what's happening, or an idea gets teased out. And that definitely impacts me later in the studio. So there's like so little separation. I feel like it's so integrated into so many of my conversations that it's always continually developing and happening. And I super appreciate it, and it makes a huge difference.
Thank you both for those answers. We have a question from Peggy Schiffer who says, I would like the name of the Scandinavian architect and the title of the book he wrote, which Caroline just mentioned.
I will put it in the chat because like I said, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it totally right. Finnish is one of those languages that if you don't know, it has lots and lots of consonants and vowels in one word. Like they're just like the longest words in the world. But I'll put it here.
Thank you. And another anonymous audience member asks, who are each of you reading right now?
That's a good question. What am I reading? I have a book. Where is it?
I'll jump in, Caroline, while you're thinking about it. I'm deep into a number of books by James Elkins, a book called Landscapes by Berger, which has been amazing. I've been reading poetry by Paul Eluard, which if we have the time, I'll kind of close out the conversation with later. And then I forget the name of the Japanese word for a pile of books on your book stand. Mine is like a tower. I've got like 30 or 40, but it's really quite embarrassing actually. But I also will jump around and read, chapter 10 and never get back to chapter 1 in some of these books.
I'm reading, okay, so I have an Audible account, which I'm always try to listen to fiction because I love fiction. But I did get a book recently. It is called Escape to Berlin, and it's by Adrian Piper, the artist. And so the book I have, it's a copy that comes in like Italian and English. So I'm reading through it, and it seems kind of poignant because Adrian Piper made a very specific decision to leave the United States and go live abroad. And the part that I'm reading now is really about her family and upbringing and just kind of illuminating that her father really gave her a kind of freedom and a way to exist in the world that was really not conducive to the environment of the US. And that she was met with a lot of roadblocks. And so I'm kind of right at that moment. And I'm really just fascinated to read and learn more about her. It's a book that's I don't think it circulates widely. I think it was a little hard to get, kind of expensive, but super interesting read.
Thank you. That was our last question from the audience. So Cameron, we can close out with the reading.
Thanks. This is a poem called Sequence from Capital of Pain, a book by Paul Eluard, grouping of his poems. To sleep with the moon in one eye and the sun in the other, love in your mouth, a lovely bird in your hair, adorned like the fields, the woods, the roots, the sea, around the whole world so lovely and adorned. Flee across the landscape, through branches of smoke and all the fruits of the wind, stone legs with sand stockings, held by the waist, all the river's muscles, and the last concern on a face transformed.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful way to close us out. Thank you, Cameron and Caroline. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Carlos Basoldo and Michelle White on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Cy Twombly Gallery at the Menil Collection. And as is a Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you both again so much.
I want to see people. Come on.
Come on, people.
Thanks,
everybody.
so much. That was
Thank
lovely.
you.
Olga, Rini. Woo!
I submitted a little comment, but it was a little bit too late. So I just want to say thanks.
Thank you so much, you both. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank
Go
you.
see their shows
Thank you
in
so much.
Chicago.
Yeah, come visit
Hey,
us.
Christine.
Come see us in
Hi.
Chicago.
I shouldn't be doing this while
Thank you,
driving, but
everybody.
great to see you. Great conversation.
Hey,
you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, Caitlin.
Bye,
Hi,
everybody.
Caroline. Thank you.
Yes.
Hey guys, good job.
Aaron, hey.
Thanks for
Bye,
the name
everybody.
shout out.
Take care.
Bye.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.